In 1925, the United States Army War College published a report that was meant to be the final word on the subject. It was a cold, academic document filled with racist pseudoscience, and its conclusion was absolute. The Negro, it stated, was of inferior mentality, possessed a weak character, and was fundamentally subservient. The report declared that black men lacked the intelligence for technical jobs, the courage for combat, and the leadership for command. It was, in their minds, a settled fact, a biological certainty. This document became the official justification for a segregated military, a wall of prejudice built on the foundation of a lie. So, you have to ask yourself a question. How, in less than 20 years, did the same military that produced this garbage science report find itself in a position where its white bomber crews, facing the hornet's nest of Nazi Germany's air defenses, were desperately radioing their command, begging for one specific group of fighter pilots to protect them? How did a group of men, branded as inferior, become the most requested, most revered, and most effective bomber escorts in the entire 15th Air Force? The answer is a story of two wars fought at the same time. One was against the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs of the Luftwaffe in the skies over Europe. The other was against the crushing weight of prejudice in their own country. To win the first war, they had to be good, but to win the second, they had to be perfect. This is the story of how the German Luftwaffe learned to fear the pilots they were programmed to dismiss. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, the men who painted the tails of their planes crimson red, and in doing so rewrote history in a language of fire and steel. The journey to those blood-red tails began not in a cockpit, but in a political firestorm. By the late 1930s, with war looming, civil rights leaders were hammering the Roosevelt administration with an undeniable hypocrisy. How could America claim to be a champion of democracy abroad while denying it to 13 million of its own citizens at home? The pressure worked, but only just. In 1941, the War Department announced the formation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black flying unit. But they didn't call it a new chapter in military history. They called it the Tuskegee Experiment. That word, experiment, is crucial. It was a test, and one that many in power fully expected, and even hoped, would fail. They sent the cadets to a segregated, hastily built airfield in Tuskegee, Alabama, under the command of white officers who largely shared the views of that 1925 report. The deck was stacked against them from day one. But the architects of this experiment made a catastrophic miscalculation. They failed to understand that when you subject men to immense pressure, you don't always break them. Sometimes you create diamonds. The training at Tuskegee was brutal, a crucible designed to weed out any hint of imperfection. The cadets knew they weren't just flying for themselves. They were flying for the future of their entire race in the armed forces. A single failure could be used as an excuse to shut the whole thing down. So, they pushed themselves beyond all reasonable limits. While white cadets in other programs flew about 200 hours to get their wings, the men at Tuskegee flew 300. The washout rate, the percentage of cadets who failed the program, was a staggering 60%, far higher than the 40% in white programs. The instructors, led by the base commander, Colonel Noel Parrish, demanded a level of precision and discipline that was almost inhuman. He wasn't just creating pilots. He was creating a super-selected group, an undeniable rebuttal to the lies that had held them down for so long. When the first graduates, led by the stoic and brilliant Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., finally shipped out to North Africa in April 1943, they weren't rookies. They were some of the most rigorously trained pilots in the world. Davis himself was the living embodiment of their struggle. The son of America's first black general, He had endured 4 years of the silent treatment at West Point, where no white cadet would speak to him outside of official duties. He had weathered the storm of institutional racism with unbreakable dignity. Now he was leading his men into a war where the enemy in front of them might be less hostile than the allies beside them. Their arrival in Tunisia was a cold bath of reality. They were attached to the 33rd Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel William Momyer, a man who saw the experiment as a waste of time and resources. He didn't hide his contempt. He gave them second-hand, worn-out P-40 Warhawk fighters, tough, rugged planes, but already obsolete and hopelessly outclassed by the German Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. Then he assigned them to the military equivalent of dish duty, coastal patrols, routine sweeps over the Mediterranean, milk runs far from the real fighting. It was a deliberate strategy to sideline them to ensure they never had a chance to prove themselves, so he could write in his reports that the experiment had failed. For weeks, the pilots of the 99th flew these frustrating, pointless missions. Morale began to sink. They had trained to be warriors, and here they were being treated like children who couldn't be trusted with the sharp knives. But then, on July the 2nd, 1943, everything changed. While escorting B-25 bombers on a raid against a German airfield in Sicily, First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall saw 2 Focke-Wulf 190s diving on the bombers. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. Hall broke formation and wrenched his P-40 into a tight turn, getting inside the German fighter's path. He squeezed the trigger, and a stream of 50 caliber tracer rounds stitched across the enemy's fuselage. "I fired a long burst," he later reported, "and saw my tracers penetrate the second aircraft. He was turning, but suddenly fell off and headed straight into the ground." He had done it. A black American pilot, flying an inferior plane, had just shot down one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighters. When Hall landed back at base, the news spread like wildfire. The black ground crews, the mechanics and armorers who had endured the same daily insults as the pilots, erupted in celebration. They lifted Hall onto their shoulders, parading him around the airfield. They had an answer now, a real, tangible victory that no one could take away from them. That afternoon, a single swastika was painted on the side of Hall's Warhawk. It was the first of 112 that would eventually be credited to the Tuskegee Airmen. The first crack had appeared in the wall of prejudice, but one victory wasn't enough to silence the doubters. In fact, it barely made a dent. Colonel Momyer continued to file negative reports, culminating in a devastating assessment sent up the chain of command. He claimed the 99th lacked aggressiveness, that they were timid in combat, and he officially recommended they be removed from frontline duty and reassigned to coastal patrol permanently. The experiment, in his view, was a failure. The report landed on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, the commander of the entire Army Air Forces. The threat was now existential. The Tuskegee program was on the brink of being shut down for good. All the training, all the sacrifice, Charles Hall's victory, all of it was about to be erased by the stroke of a pen based on the biased report of one prejudiced commander. Just as the axe was about to fall, fate intervened in the form of a bloody beachhead called Anzio. In January 1944, Allied forces were desperately clinging to a sliver of Italian coastline, and the Luftwaffe was throwing everything it had at them in massive, relentless waves. It was a chaotic, desperate fight for survival. On January 27th, the call went out for every available fighter, and the 99th was scrambled. 15 Tuskegee pilots in their obsolete P-40s flew into a sky swarming with superior German Focke-Wulf 190s. They were outnumbered and outgunned. According to Momier's report, they should have broken and run, but they didn't. They tore into the German formations with a ferocity that stunned everyone. Over 2 days of savage fighting above the beaches, the men Momier had called timid shot down 12 German fighters. Lieutenant Charles Hall got 2 more, bringing his personal total to 3. Captain Lemuel Custis shot down another. Pilot after pilot registered kills. In 48 hours, they had destroyed more enemy aircraft than in their entire previous 7 months of combat combined. The performance was so spectacular, so completely at odds with Momier's report, that it couldn't be ignored. The War Department, forced to investigate, launched a statistical study comparing the 99th's record with other P-40 squadrons in the theater. The conclusion was undeniable. When you factored in their equipment and the types of missions they were given, the 99th was performing just as well, if not better, than their white counterparts. The experiment was over. Anzio had saved them. They had proven they could fight. Now they were about to get the chance to prove they could do something even more important. Protect. In May 1944, a new chapter began. The 99th was combined with 3 other Tuskegee-trained squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, to form the 332nd Fighter Group. They were transferred to the 15th Air Force in Italy and given a new, daunting mission, long-range bomber escort. This was the big league. Their job was to fly hundreds of miles into the heart of Nazi Germany, shepherding vast formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators to their targets and back. It was one of a pilot's most dangerous and difficult jobs. Colonel Benjamin Davis gathered his men at their new base at Ramitelli. He knew this was their ultimate test. He laid down a new doctrine, an ironclad rule that would come to define them. Our job is not to be aces, he told them. Forget chasing enemy fighters for personal glory. Our job is to bring those bombers home. We will stick with the bombers no matter what. This was a radical idea. Most American fighter groups operated on a more aggressive doctrine, encouraging pilots to roam and hunt, to rack up kills. Davis demanded discipline over glory. He knew that the true measure of their success wouldn't be the number of swastikas painted on their planes, but the number of bomber crews who made it home for dinner. Around this time, the 15th Air Force issued an order for all fighter groups to paint their aircraft with distinctive markings for easy identification in the chaos of battle. The 392nd was assigned the color red, and they didn't just paint a little stripe on the wing. They went all in. The entire tail section of their brand new P-51 Mustangs was painted a brilliant, unmistakable crimson. With their red tails, red propeller spinners, and red nose bands, they became a flash of color in the cold European sky. The legend of the red tails was born. At first, the white bomber crews didn't know who these new escorts were. They didn't know they were black. All they knew was that something was different. These red-tailed fighters didn't dart off chasing German planes at the first opportunity. They stayed close, weaving a protective shield around the vulnerable, lumbering bombers. They were like guardian angels. If a bomber was damaged and fell out of formation, becoming a sitting duck, a pair of red tails would often peel off and stick with it, fighting off attackers all the way home. Word began to spread like a gospel through the bomber bases in Italy. The crews started calling them the Red Tail Angels. Briefing rooms would buzz with the question, "Who's our escort today?" If the answer was the 332nd, a wave of relief would wash over the room. It got to the point where bomber groups would specifically request the Red Tails for the toughest missions. The men who had been deemed unfit for combat were now the most sought-after protectors in the sky. Their discipline, Born from the harsh training at Tuskegee and forged by Colonel Davis's unwavering command, was paying the ultimate dividend, saving American lives. They were losing fewer bombers to enemy fighters than any other escort group in the 15th Air Force. The final numbers would be staggering. On average, other P-51 groups lost 46 bombers under their watch. The Red Tails lost only 27. But their greatest test, the mission that would cement their legacy in aviation history, was yet to come. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, but Germany had one last terrifying card to play. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was a technological nightmare for Allied pilots. With a top speed of over 540 miles per hour, it was 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. It was a silver shark that could appear, strike, and vanish before a propeller-driven pilot even knew what was happening. To fight it seemed impossible. On March 24, 1945, the 392nd was given the most challenging assignment of its career, escorting B-17s on a 1,600-mile round trip to Berlin to bomb the Daimler-Benz tank factory. It was the longest mission they had ever flown, taking them deep into the hornet's nest. And intelligence warned them that the target was being defended by Jägerschwader 7, an elite unit equipped with the fearsome Me-262 jets. Colonel Davis led the mission himself. As the 43 Mustangs approached Berlin, the jets appeared, the largest formation of German jets ever assembled for a single battle. They sliced through the sky, their turbine engines screaming. But the Red Tails were ready. They had studied the jet's weaknesses. It was faster, but it couldn't turn as sharply as the Mustang, and its acceleration was poor. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown remembered their strategy. We knew the German jets were faster. Instead of going directly after them, we went away from them and then turned into their blind spots. It was a brilliant tactical adjustment. As a jet swooped in, Brown and his wingman turned not toward it, but away, forcing the German pilot to overshoot. Then, as the jet blasted past, they whipped their Mustangs around and got on its tail. Brown opened fire. I pulled up at him in a 15-degree climb and fired 3 long bursts, his combat report read. Almost immediately, the pilot bailed out. 1 jet down. That same day, Lieutenant Earl Lane did the impossible, hitting an Me-262 from over half a mile away with a miraculous deflection shot. And Lieutenant Charles Brantley bagged a 3rd. In a single afternoon, the Red Tails had shot down 3 of Hitler's superweapons. To put that in perspective, that was more jets than most American fighter groups would destroy in the entire war. For this incredible achievement, the 392nd Fighter Group was awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation, one of the military's highest honors. They had faced the future of aerial combat and defeated it. The mockery of the Luftwaffe pilots, if there ever was any, had long since turned to a grim and grudging respect. They reportedly had a name for them. Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the Black Birdmen. Not every pilot's war ended in victory. 32 Tuskegee Airmen were shot down and became prisoners of war. Their experience reveals the strange and bitter ironies of the conflict. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson's P-51 was hit by flak over southern France in August 1944. When he was captured and taken for interrogation, he was shocked by what the German officer knew. The interrogator had information about Ramitelli Airfield, about our squadron commanders, even details about my parents' home in Detroit, Jefferson recalled. He knew my father was a teacher and my mother's maiden name. Their intelligence was frighteningly thorough. The Germans knew exactly who he was and where he came from. They knew all about the experiment. Jefferson was sent to Stalag Luft III, the infamous prison camp featured in the movie The Great Escape. And it was there that the full absurdity of his situation hit him. Inside a Nazi POW camp, he found a level of integration he had never known in America. The white American POWs, many of them bomber crewmen, treated him as an equal. They would come up to him, shake his hand, and thank him for the red tail protection that had kept them alive for so long. Here I was, Jefferson said, in a Nazi POW camp, being treated more equally by white Americans than I would be back home. When the war ended and Jefferson was liberated, the first thing that happened when he stepped back onto American soil was that he was segregated from the white soldiers. He had fought and nearly died for his country. He had been honored as an equal by his comrades in a German prison, only to return home to the same demeaning prejudice he had left behind. He had won the war against fascism, but the war against racism was far from over. When the final accounting was done, the numbers were a stunning refutation of every lie that had been told about them. Over 15,000 individual sorties, 178 combat missions, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, another 150 destroyed on the ground. They had even sunk a German destroyer with machine gun fire. 96 pilots earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, and their bomber protection record was second to none. But their greatest victory wasn't measured in statistics. It was measured in the change they forced upon a reluctant nation. Their performance provided irrefutable proof that the color of a pilot's skin had nothing to do with his ability to fly and fight. Their combat record was a powerful weapon used by civil rights activists after the war, and it was a major factor in President Harry Truman's decision in 1948 to sign Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. The men who had begun as an experiment had become the architects of a revolution. Recognition came slowly, almost criminally so. For decades, their story was largely forgotten by mainstream America. It wasn't until 2007 that the Tuskegee Airmen were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor. By then, only 300 of the original pilots were still alive to receive it. But their legacy was already written. It was written in the contrails of their Mustangs over Berlin. It was written in the grateful memories of the thousands of bomber crewmen they brought home safely. And it was written in the fabric of an American military and an American society that they helped to change forever. As Roscoe Brown, the man who shot down a jet over Berlin, put it, "We didn't just fight the Germans, we fought ignorance, prejudice, and hatred, and we won all three battles. They were set up to fail, expected to fail, and in the end they did the one thing their doubters never thought possible. They soared